Welcome to Talk Radioisotopes, Going Nuclear on Cancer. I'm your host, Scott Larrivee. This show is your one-stop shop for all things radiopharmaceuticals, and I'm pleased to have alongside me today our co-host, Dr. Sarah Scouten. Sarah has a distinguished career that includes time in consulting and private equity, and she also started her own company. She was the CEO of Illuminating Diagnostics, a startup company based on her own invention. If that weren't enough, she spent a decade in academics. She's got a PhD in biochemistry from SUNY Buffalo, and we are thrilled to have her as our podcast co-host. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Well, we're thrilled to have your insights and thoughts as we dive in here. This show is really intended to give everyone a broad overview of what's going on in radiotherapeutics, radiopharmaceuticals. We'll have different guests on each week that'll cover different topics, and our guest this week is Jeff Jones of Oppenheimer. We are thrilled to have him with us. Jeff is a managing director and senior analyst covering biotechnology for Oppenheimer. Prior to this role, he founded and ran One Health Advisors, which provided strategic advisory services for human and animal biopharma sector. And he served in numerous roles with biotechnology companies. He has a BA in biology from the University of Virginia and a PhD in cell and molecular biology from Baylor College of Medicine. And again, if that weren't enough, he completed an MBA at Cornell University, Johnson Graduate School of Management. So I am thrilled to have these two experts with me. Welcome to the show, Jeff.
Thank you very much, Scott. Great to be here.
Great to have you. Well, tell us a little bit about your current role at Oppenheimer, kind of what you're working on a day-to-day basis, and then we'll get into some of the recent developments in the field.
Great. I'm happy to, Scott. So, as you noted, I've been in the space for near 20 years, but most of that time has been on the corporate side of biotech, 15 years doing business development, licensing, et cetera. 3.5 years or so now over on the equity research side at Oppenheimer, where I cover a range of companies in both the I&I and oncology space. But relevant to today, we've spent a lot of energy over the last 2.5 years following the targeted radiopharmaceutical space, and that really involves all of the key value drivers and stakeholders here, from isotope suppliers to therapeutics companies and imaging companies. And so really we're tracking near 60 companies in the space at this point.
Yeah, you guys are definitely on top of things and are a resource that I know a lot of people look to. I'm interested with your experience prior to Oppenheimer. How do you try to bring some of that outside experience to your current role? What does that inform? Does that inform or change how you look at some of these companies?
I think it does. And I think it's that history of being within an operating company, with being on a senior leadership team, and participating in board meetings and being part of that process and making decisions at the board level, giving us insight into how companies think about making those big strategic decisions. Not only how it affects investors, but how it affects employees and the companies moving forward, and positioning and providing strategic options.
Sarah, did you have a similar experience having kind of worked in the private sector and then kind of gone to the private sector, but on the research side? Did you find that it was informative to kind of have that background as well?
Oh, absolutely. I think, as you mentioned, in the intro, my background, it spans, from finance, and the industry and academia. And I think bringing it together, you get a different perspective, because it's such a complicated process from A to Z, right, to get things from the bench and into patients. That absolutely, having that kind of experience, especially in this area, with targeted radiopharmaceuticals, which we're going to get into more. But I think they have many levels of complexity above just a standard drug development situation. So, it really helps to be able to understand that more holistically. So.
Absolutely. Well, you mentioned it. Let's dive right in. Let's talk about where the radiotherapeutics market is today and where it may be going. And Jeff, I thought a good jumping off point for us would be that Oppenheimer just hosted its own targeted radiotherapy summit back in October, so not too long ago. What were kind of your key takeaways from that event, and how have you seen that evolve over time?
Yeah, it's been a great sort of look at the space as it evolves over the last couple of years. It's really only our second annual event. We had a doubling in the number of investor attendees this year, and really a doubling of the attendees overall in terms of the number of companies participating in the heightened investor interest, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a bit. The event really focused on three things. One was the PSMA targeted radiotherapies. This being a crowded space and how companies are trying to differentiate themselves. We talked a lot about next generation technologies, the number of new companies that have come along, investments in technology platforms, optimizing product profiles, targeting molecules, be they peptides, nanobodies, or others, really to optimize that delivery of radiation to the tumor, minimizing exposure to normal tissue. And then we dove into the supply chain as well, really looking at it from a perspective of from isotope supply all the way through delivery to the patient.
That's wonderful. I know you had a big group there. One of the things that I believe you updated in or around that conference is what I call the infamous Oppenheimer chart. This is we'll put this on the screen for the people watching the video version of the podcast. But this is one quick shot of everything that's going on in the market. I call it infamous because it's been referenced by so many people and in so many different places. Admittedly, within a niche market of those of us tracking radiopharmaceuticals, but it's infamous in that world. Tell me, how did that chart come about, and what goes into it?
So a couple of people have taken shots at putting these charts together, and I guess this is our version of it. It's really a labor of love for our team here, as we're targeting, as I mentioned, over 60 companies in the space, and tracking these portfolios as products mature, really finding a way to visually put all of this down in one place for people to have a look at where this space is today. And the chart, as you mentioned, that we updated in October just after our event, is an evolution from one we put out over the summer, really bringing in not only the small companies, but also now large pharma portfolios with all the M&A that's gone on of late. And unfortunately, as big as that chart is, we're still leaving companies off just because there's only so much room, and the font can only get so small before you can't read anything.
Right.
Well, the good news is giant TVs are getting cheaper and cheaper by the day, so we'll just
Right.
keep blowing it up.
No, it seems like a really, definitely it's a valuable chart to look at things all together like this. So I'm just wondering, like, what you think, like some of the key takeaways, when you look at this chart, and what do you think the trends are screaming, in this October version that you've updated?
I think one thing that's highlighted is really the move of large pharma into the space, and now that rather than just really having Novartis on there, we now have several large pharmas on there starting to build portfolios. And I think the other thing that's noticeable there is there's a grouping of some late stage products, and only obviously Pluvicto and Lutathera on the market, and a lot of really early stage programs at the preclinical level, which typically as an equity research analyst, we probably wouldn't even look at preclinical. But in this space, we have to, because the space is relatively early. So you've got this big gap in phase 1 data, phase 2 data, and assets. And I think that's one of the things we're really excited about looking into next year, is as these assets start to mature.
Well, let's dive into that a bit. By my count, since kind of the end of 2023, there's been, give or take, roughly $9 billion worth of acquisitions in this space. As you mentioned, we're starting to see the big pharmaceutical companies join in. Was 2024 a tipping point for this industry?
I definitely agree with that characterization. I'd say, it started right at the end of 2023 and continued well into 2024. You saw initially the first pharma company, not Novartis, come into the space and start M&A, something that people had really been looking for. And so that was the Lilly Point transaction. That was quickly followed by Bristol Myers and Ray's Bio, and then AstraZeneca and Fusion. Then Novartis coming in a bit later and adding to their pipeline with the Mariana acquisition. So this has really driven heightened excitement in the space by both public and private investors, to really help validate this platform technology.
And is your sense that these types of transactions, were they kind of piecing themselves together along the way, or was this somebody jumped in and then a few others said we got to get in there too? What's your sense on how folks got into it?
There's always a fear of missing out, by pharma and folks following on, and I think Novartis had finally convinced the market that targeted radio was real when you saw Pluvicto being on the path to nearly $1 billion in revenue last year, and they'll be well over $1 billion in revenue this year. And with that, you drive this M&A. And if you look at that M&A, a lot of the acquisitions brought in infrastructure. They brought in supply agreements, facilities, things like that. Not necessarily a lot of pipeline. And so I think that's where things go from here as they think about how then do we fill those pipelines at these and leverage these facilities and infrastructure that they've acquired.
That's interesting. Anyone on the sidelines that you're keeping your eye on and watching in the year ahead?
Yeah, I definitely think there are a couple of folks on the sideline. Merck, for example, hasn't jumped in. They're obviously a huge player in oncology with Keytruda. They are equity investors in a number of private rounds, and so we definitely see them being actively looking at the space. J&J and Roche are also, I would say, prime candidates. J&J had clinical data at ASCO last year, or still this year, for a targeted radio asset. So we know they're doing things in-house, but they haven't done any M&A or call it large licensing deals. Roche, through Genentech, is obviously also a huge player in oncology. They haven't come in, but you have seen them do some deals with PeptiDream more around discovery. So they're active in this space as well, but haven't come out with what I'd call a major licensing or M&A deal.
So in your mind, as we look into 2025, what kind of transactions do you anticipate? Are you thinking it's more mergers and acquisitions, or is it, and I know the lawyers hate this term, but collaborations or partnerships, or what are you kind of watching for?
I do still think there's room for M&A, but a lot of these assets are early. The Mariana takeout was a surprise. They weren't even in phase 1 yet when Novartis stepped in and bought them for $1 billion. But not only an interesting asset, but a really interesting platform there. I think what we see more this year is traditional, as you called it, licensing and partnership type deals, as companies look to fill those pipelines and the infrastructure I mentioned. We saw this earlier this year, the deal with Lilly and Actis around discovering new products, new pipeline assets for Lilly to interrogate some new targets. We saw a deal with Sanofi recently, licensing a program out of Oranomed. So I think the majority of deals are going to shift towards licensing, certainly as you get more technology validation of some of these platforms on early clinical data.
Yeah, you mentioned kind of the pipelines and that people are starting to fill the pipeline. They're building their infrastructure. I want to dive into all that, but I almost kind of maybe a silly question, but maybe not. Is the efficacy of radiotherapeutics a done deal at this point, or do you think the industry still has to prove broad clinical effectiveness?
I think, I think efficacy has been validated through Pluvicto and Lutathera. There's still dramatic room for improvement just on those products, and I think we clearly see a lot of companies chasing those two targets, PSMA and SSTR2, in prostate cancer and neuroendocrine, respectively. However, it's still very early in this field. There's a lot of work to be done on defining what makes a target suitable for targeted radiotherapy. What do target profiles look like with different isotopes, alpha emitters versus beta emitters? What tumor types, targets, products line up best? What are optimal dosing schedules, dose intensity? So there are a lot of unanswered questions at this point, and those questions get, run across or get more complex as we look at different targeting platforms, because we have to answer those questions for different platforms. We do know that targeted radiopharmaceuticals work. Delivery of radiation to a tumor kills tumor cells, and we know that both through targeted radio as well as traditional radiotherapy. Now it's really looking at how do we target that delivery, how do we optimize delivery to tumor cells, minimize damage to normal tissue.
Yeah. Sarah, is that your take too, working with companies and talking to folks in the industry? Is it finding the right isotope for the right tumor? Is that kind of the next phase here?
Actually, I think I actually had a comment a little bit more related to what Jeff, you mentioned about the FOMA in this space at the beginning, where everybody gets in, and I think that ties in well with this year. Is that I think at first, the street and investors, their interest was piqued because of the success of Novartis, and I think that there was a lower level of understanding for all of these nuances, like Pluvicto works, but all of these other things, the street, I think, really needs to grow as the industry grows, as far as their knowledge base on just these key points with targets and isotopes and how they work. So how they all work together to specifically be optimized for each type of cancer. So I think, part of what we want to do here, obviously, with is talk to experts like you and get your take on how we can make sure that this message gets, this message and this education gets, translated into onto the street and so they can understand drug development for this, because you talked about efficacy, and we know, like you said, that the radiation kills tumor cells, right? So then the next question is, well, do all types of radiation kill similarly, right? So you maybe would have a way of understanding how to vet which isotopes are better than other ones. So as far as jumping ahead to looking at clinical studies that are in the pipeline, we see like a lot of lutetium and actinium being focused on, but how do we understand which ones are best for the next phase? Are those the only ones that are suitable, or are there other ones that could fit the bill?
That's a great question, Jeff. What's your take? You're tracking, obviously you've got the chart. We all know and love the chart, but actinium, lutetium seem to get a lot of attention right now, but I know there's other isotopes kind of coming onto the scene. What do you see picking up attention from companies and maybe even investors?
Yeah, totally agree. Lutetium and actinium. Lutetium's clearly validated. That is what's behind Lutathera and Pluvicto. Actinium, there's a great deal of excitement about it. It's an extremely potent isotope. Clear challenges in availability that are likely to resolve over the next couple of years. But as you look beyond those, and lutetium being a beta emitter, actinium an alpha emitter, There are also recent clinical data coming out around lead-212, another alpha emitter, very potent, is showing promising efficacy in a number of studies. But it has its own set of challenges due to its 10-hour half-life. Beyond really lutetium, actinium, and lead, I'd probably point to copper, an alpha emitter, copper-67. There's some interesting work going on there, and it matches nicely on the imaging side with copper-64. And then there was some really interesting data at the European Radio Conference, EANM, recently on terbium, which is an Auger emitter, a little more exotic. Really early data at this point, and again, supply chain challenges around terbium that people really haven't even started to look at this point. So there are additional isotopes beyond lutetium and actinium. There's data being generated, some at academic centers, some at early at companies. But there's certainly more to come on the isotope side beyond actinium and lutetium.
Yeah.
So you
Let's
think
talk
it would be, I'm sorry, you
Go
think it
ahead,
would
Sarah.
be fair to say that the initial isotopes were chosen based on availability or maybe, and then the reason why everybody's kind of following on is because there's already a known approval pathway with that one, and that perhaps,
A lot of this comes out of academic work that was done in Europe and in particular in Germany. And actinium and lutetium were both available there in small quantities for academic and hospital studies, and they have a different sort of regulatory flexibility for treating patients in academic studies there with targeted radiotherapies. So that's where you saw a lot of this early work done. That's where the molecules behind Pluvicto, Lutathera, Points 2002, all came out of academic European centers, and linking that, as you point out, to the availability of actinium and lutetium in small quantities for academic type studies. And there are also, convenient half-lives of those isotopes in the, call it 7 to 10 day range for lutetium and actinium that makes them relatively convenient to work with.
So what's your take on kind of where things stand? There's the argument that, the supply chain will figure itself out and all we need is great drug development. There's the argument that there's not going to be enough supply to keep up. How do you kind of assess the market right now, knowing that it'll be a multi-year type of thing as these drugs go through trials and play out? But what's your take on kind of how prepared the industry is to really do this from a logistical standpoint?
So from an isotope perspective, focusing it there, lutetium is fairly well available at this point. A number of companies have lutetium available on a regular basis. Actinium, there have been multiple headlines about trials getting put on hold or lack of availability. And we're starting to see news from companies as they're announcing availability of actinium. And announcing it's available and actually having material available for, say, a large clinical study are very different matters. So I think at this early stage, the industry's early, there's a need for actinium at a low level, small clinical trials mostly. I think by the end of 2025, we're going to be in a scenario where, we'll be able to supply through multiple companies actinium for those small clinical studies. We're certainly won't be in a position to supply large multiple phase 3 studies by the end of this year. But I think as additional supply comes online in 2025, late 25 and into 26, I think, it's going to more or less meet demand.
So the picture's
But
getting
that's through a
brighter.
lot of investment in a lot of companies.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so there seems like
absolutely.
there's big opportunities for producers to step up and meet the demand. So that to
Yeah,
really enable all these new drugs to come through clinical trials and to come to market. So
absolutely.
Well, maybe that's a good jumping off point to say let's look into the future a little bit. As we sit here recording this, we're at the end of 2024. This will air in early 2025. What are you watching in the year ahead, and what piques your interest?
I think what's exciting for us looking into next year is really starting to see some of the validating proof of concept work coming out of all these new technology platforms that venture investors have put their money behind. So we're really looking towards early clinical data from some of these new targeting platforms, thinking Actis, who recently presented at the Triple Conference, some imaging data, Abdera, hopefully have some clinical data there. YMABs with their pre-targeting platform, we expect to announce data, sort of proof of concept data early next year, really talk about strategies for leveraging their pre-targeting platform, some updates from Perspective Therapeutics. So really it's around early clinical data to validate some of these novel technology platforms, really helping us to understand how these platforms match up against isotope profiles for delivery of radiation in the right time frame, minimizing exposure to normal tissues.
So it seems like we've got a lot of clinical trials going on. It sounds like it'll be a pretty big year in terms of just seeing directionally where those are headed and what types of outcomes they're able to generate.
Yep. I think that clinical data on platforms as well as data on new targets. Nectin-4, as we move beyond PSMA and SSTR2, looking at DLL3, Nectin-4, FAP, and others.
Sarah, anything you've got your eye on in the year ahead?
just like the same thing, it is watching as these other earlier trials are advancing with these different novel isotopes. I think is interesting, but it's more looking at how these. Honestly, from my perspective, it's looking at how are these radiotherapies being administered to patients at the end of the radiopharmaceuticals journey, right? Because I think there's more than just getting these drugs through trial. I mean, you need the whole clinical. Let me see them. What's the best word to say? Like all the clinicians, they have to be able to administer these drugs because it's not the same as just giving a chemotherapeutic. There's like specialty radiopharmacies that have to supply it, and there's oncologists that have to bring it into their practice, and so that's another thing that I want to be looking ahead to beyond just the drug development is how are patients going to get this drugs, and how are healthcare institutions and providers going to also step up to expand use of these therapies as they're approved, because certainly they have already shown promises as being very having a lot of efficacy in treating patients. So
Right.
that's what I'm looking at.
Absolutely. Yeah, as things move from the lab to practice, that's one of the trends and things that we'll be exploring on this podcast. So, Sarah, thank you for giving everyone a plug to stay locked on Talk Radioisotopes because you don't want to miss out. Okay, that's enough about us. Jeff, before we let you go, we can't talk to anybody at the end of a year with a look ahead show without talking about the fact that the United States just went through a national election. Donald Trump returns to office. The Republicans take over both houses of Congress. How might that impact the regulatory environment for radiotherapeutics? Or does it? Or does any of it matter?
It's certainly a question that's impacting biotech broadly right now. From what we've seen so far, there's clear concern around the vaccine side of biotech. But in terms of targeted radiotherapies, we're not really seeing an impact or concern that I would flag at this point. We just seen some CMS guidance coming out on reimbursement for radiopharm diagnostics. That's very encouraging. So at this point, I think things look pretty good or pretty clear as far as targeted radiopharm space.
Hmm.
Being this is a novel methodology, it's oncology, we're not anticipating a lot of pushback on this particular sector at all.
Okay. Well, and it's a
Yeah, I think
sector that. Go ahead, Sarah.
I said I think I want to add to that. I feel like these cancer therapy development is something that goes beyond like political party. But if I had to make a comment on just the tone going into it, I would think that there would be more of a push for domestic supplies of radioisotopes, which as many people in the industry know, has been an ongoing challenge that these isotopes come from principally from Russia and other countries outside of the United States. So in general, even before the election, there's been this real push to try and bring that technology and production capacity and back into the United States. So I'm hoping, that I think that this administration would be also on board with that kind of initiative. So
Yeah,
Yep.
I think that it'll, to your point, Sarah, I think it'll amplify that something that's been ongoing, which is solidifying that supply chain for domestic or domestic and European supply of these radioisotopes, which a lot of had been coming out of Russia, as you mentioned.
Well, and when I talk to people, family members and others, I explain this isn't an industry that we have to bring back from offshore. This is an industry that's growing up, and really the half-life of these products make it ripe for domestic supply chain. And I think that'll be really interesting to watch and track as we go through not just next year, but the next few years as this really grows up. And I imagine we're going to have regional hubs and centers of kind of innovation and excellence. Jeff, do you see that kind of playing out?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we just saw, Novartis had been getting most of their supply for lutetium from a single supplier in Europe. They've recently announced that they're going to build out some isotope supply of their own in California. You see a number of suppliers, and Nusano being one, looking to establish additional supply. So we absolutely need additional capacity to produce these isotopes, to supply the larger clinical trials that we all hope are on the way, let alone commercial scale supply. So there's going to be a significant need for isotope supply. And as Sarah mentioned, these isotopes have a very short half-life, and so you can't stockpile isotope or final drug product. And so these integrated supply chains become very important, and the ability to manufacture domestically just makes a great deal of sense.
Absolutely. Let's just, we like to always kind of close the show with kind of a look at the road ahead. And we ask people, if you had a magic wand and everything in this industry succeeded, what do you think the world looks like in about 5 years? Do we have one or two more approved drugs? Do we have 30? What's kind of your prognosis for best case scenario for this industry and hopefully how it can help patients?
I think in, call it the 5 year time frame, I think we've got a number of additional approved drugs. 5 years sounds like a long time, but when you're talking about drugs that are really just getting into phase one now, it's still going to be a while. I think we'll have more approved drugs in 5 years. I think we will have a robust pipeline of late stage clinical products at that point, these phase two, phase three stage products. We'll have answered a number of the questions around optimal dose and timing of dosing, kinetics for these products to maximize the opportunity for patients. And This is pharma, so in biopharma, and so you've also got to look at the competitive space. These radiopharmaceuticals compete against everything else in the oncology space, but we have clear efficacy, a clear advantage in being able to image tumors and patients' responses to therapy. And so I think there's going to be a really nice synergy between not only the clinicians, as Sarah was mentioning, but the collaboration between clinicians and patients as you look at the impact of these tumors. And so I see a growing opportunity for these therapeutics and the imaging agents that go along with them moving forward in the next 5 years.
When I look ahead to this, that I think, I agree with Jeff about the opportunities with the radiopharmaceuticals themselves, but because of this just rapidly growing industry, I think that there's also just related opportunities around it. As I mentioned, opportunities for producing isotopes, opportunities for radiopharmacies to grow, for oncology practices to grow and really step up to meet this demand. And then there's the also even just going back to radiochemists, this is an expertise that we've kind of let go, and I think is opportunities within our education system and to really train and start building a workforce that can handle this very specialized type of substances, of radioisotopes. And then even downstream, we have to say some of these things still have some residual radioactivity. So how are we going to handle, the waste disposal at the hospitals? They have to scale that up, because you don't want to, some of these things you don't just, want to dispose of the most normal way. So there's opportunities across the board that are related. And as I can see that happening, it's really interesting, because as I think we re-strengthen our radio isotope capabilities here within the United States, it's going to have effects on outside of medicine, even with industrial applications for isotopes. So I think that it just opens up a lot of doors and opportunities.
I agree. Certainly going to be a lot to watch in the year ahead. Jeff, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate you lending your time and expertise. If folks want to learn more about Oppenheimer and your team, where can they go?
We certainly have a website, and you can also always reach out to me directly at jeff.jones@opco.com to get information as to our activities and coverage on the research side.
Well, that is fantastic. I know we'll all be watching for updates to the chart. I can't tell you how many times I've heard, we need a chart like that Oppenheimer one. So thanks to you and the team for giving people across the industry a bunch of homework assignments to try to come up with something half as good as what you guys have going on. Thanks so much, Jeff. Really appreciate the time, and we will catch up with you down the road, and love to check back in and see how things are looking in the year ahead, a little further down the road.
Great talking with you, Scott. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks, Jeff. Talk Radioisotopes is brought to you by Nusano, empowering the world's leading companies, healthcare providers, and innovators with the radioisotopes needed to advance cancer care and other applications. Find out more at nusano.com. Talk Radioisotopes is powered by the award-winning team at Caspian Studios. Produced by Mark Wolf-Roberts. Video editing by Scott Levine. Audio editing by Scott Goodrich. Designed by Landon Pontius, and our supervising producer is Bradley Glansrock. I'm your host, Scott Larrivee, Head of Marketing and Communications for Nusano. Thank you for joining us, and be sure to check out the show at talkradioisotopes.com.